So, I'm going to speak with you today about what's happening in Chicago in particular, and about the fact that essentially we now have a hostile occupation of an American city by federal paramilitary troops. And the idea that this is particularly clear given the intensive nature of the intervention in Chicago, makes it a good case study for what is happening. But please note that this is happening in Washington, D.C., in Portland, Oregon, in Los Angeles, and I'm sure it will spread. And that there is a through line that is just obvious here that these are diverse, liberal, democratic cities, right? These are cities, especially in the case of Chicago, that had many Venezuelan immigrants shipped to them by cities in the South as an effort to try to shift the problem to cities that were sanctuary cities that were more diverse and welcoming, and that now the federal government is coming down hard with incredibly repressive tactics directed not only at apprehending gang members who are in the country without authorization and committing crimes, but also ordinary working people who are showing up for court because they have authorization to be in this country. And in addition to that, the American citizens who are protesting this are being subject to lawless and grotesque violence. I will say more about this when we get deeper into it, but I will start out with an inflammatory but I think accurate statement that American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq conducted themselves with greater lawfulness and respect than are the ice shock troops in the streets of Chicago. And this reveals something that I think is essential about the nature of this occupation in contrast with occupations that the American military conducted of countries and cities in those countries that we were invading and fighting the army and then fighting insurgencies that in the context of Afghanistan and Iraq, American troops were trying to, as we like to say, win hearts and minds. We were not merely trying to brutalize the population or to root out the enemy. We were actually trying to convince them that we are here to help you reestablish a ordered civil society. And that unlike that, the ICE troops in Chicago view their mission as to spread fear and to repress without any concern for the consent or support of the people that they are repressing. That this is an effort to identify and then intimidate the quote enemy within, and that at this point, reflecting on the demonstrations that everybody was involved with yesterday, in the No King's Day, that we really are at a new stage, I think, in the struggle for the future of America. We're no longer at a stage where we can credibly believe, that the normal institutional avenues of American constitutional democracy, using the courts, using elections, using peaceful civil protest, can actually change the course or check and balance or protect the safety of average Americans. And so that we are in a period now where the struggle seems to be between repression and resistance. And please note, right, that the agents of the state have the weapons, have the tear gas, have the unmarked vehicles, have the body armor, have the capacity to intimidate the local police and the local population and to rain terror down on our cities. And that the appropriate response in these conditions is hard to chart, but it does involve, on the one hand, showing to our fellow Americans that this is not the course that most of us endorse. And that's what was done at those protests yesterdays. And I think that's extraordinarily important. And then trying to reach those of our citizens who may be misled by social media or by partisan mobilization into believing that there really is deep lawlessness in these cities. And please note, right, that there is a kernel of the truth to some of the complaints, right, that Chicago was overwhelmed by the influx of immigrants a year, 2 years ago, that there has been a competition for resources between those who are newly arrived and long-standing citizens and residents, and that there is some crime and some very destructive crime that is uh, being conducted by international drug cartels that are smuggling uh, fentanyl and other drugs that are highly destructive to American communities into our city, but into our cities, and especially our rural areas, our towns as well. But the idea that what is happening in Chicago is in any way an effective, proportionate, targeted response to these issues, let alone effective, is belied by the nature of the way in which it is being conducted. This is not an effort to address real problems with our capacity to house and provide infrastructure and eventually assimilate a large number of people who want to be in this country but don't have documentation to permit them to be at this moment, right? Or to deal with the drug cartels that are, right, endangering many of us, leading to, right, deaths of despair that are genuinely rocking our communities. And so the idea that we have to be balanced in recognizing there is harm, there are reasons that people are concerned about the level of migration into our country, and yet what that requires then is effective responses regulated by law that are proportionate to and targeted to the problems, and not this montage of images that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail with. But I don't know if you can see, right? This is a citizen being pinned to the ground for the crime of protesting, of expressing our First Amendment rights. This is a Chicago neighborhood replete with Halloween, right, decorations that is just shrouded in tear gas because ICE, in leaving the scene, not to disperse a crowd, but after it's on its way out, throws a bunch of canisters of tear gas out the window just to terrorize and inflict pain on the community that they've now taken somebody from. And various similar images. It looks like a war zone, and it looks like the wrong kind of war zone, like a brutal occupying force is there to repress the indigenous population, not a scene that you should see in a society that is governed by the rule of law. So let me now talk a little bit in more detail about what's happening in Chicago. And I'll start with a quotation from Quincy Worthington, a pastor at Highland Park Presbyterian Church, just to give you a sense. I've never seen the brutality, just completely unprovoked, that I've seen at Broadview. That's a neighborhood in the south side of Chicago. I do think it's worthwhile. I'll show a little bit more of this graphically a little later in the lecture, but to recognize that part of the issue here is that the neighborhoods that are being subject to this kind of violent repression are largely Black and Latino neighborhoods, and that Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, and so that it's possible to insulate yourself from this, even if you are a resident of Chicago, if you're not a resident of one of those areas. Continuing, right? He recalled that he had seen a fellow pastor, quote, praying and pleading to the humanity of ICE officers who then shot him in the head with pepper balls and later doused him with pepper spray. In one particularly awful experience, I saw a handicapped woman on the ground who physically couldn't get up, and they shot her repeatedly with pepper balls to the point that by the time we could get her back to a safe place, we had to call an ambulance for her. There's no warning, no provocation. They just open up on you. Sometimes we can't even determine what they're trying to do. And again, I think it's important to recognize that this is the behavior that is being licensed, encouraged, permitted, but more than that, it is exactly what the president, the secretary of Homeland Security, the head of ICE, the officers in ICE are recruiting and encouraging their shock troops to do. They want them doing this. They don't want them following the law. And then again, the contrast with the American military and the lawful and dignified way it conducted itself for the most part. There were exceptions, there were problems, right? But having said that, generally speaking, they risked their lives not to do things in Afghanistan and Iran that ICE officers are doing in Chicago. And that should outrage us, but it should also illuminate to us the difference, right? Our troops, when occupying a foreign country, were trying to encourage them to view us as potentially on their side, despite the fact that we were an occupying force. The ICE troops in Chicago and in Los Angeles and in Portland view the people of America as their enemy and have no desire to do anything other than instill fear in us. This is the very definition of despotism, and it is the policy of the federal government of the United States with regards to its own citizens in select cities that have been targeted because they are controlled by one of our two main political parties, a party that has roughly 50% support within the population of the United States. I want to be as clear as possible. There is a corruption going on here, and I've used this term with you before. I'll just reiterate very quickly my explanation for why I think it is the correct term. And the issue is that institutions, right, especially powerful institutions that control really important mechanisms of repression that can be used within the confines of the law. These are coercive forces, right? Men and women with guns and pepper spray and vehicles that we entrust to enforce the law on the understanding that they too are subject to the law. Sorry, I inadvertently advanced the slides trying to move things around. And the idea that when you have these agencies occupied by people who understand precisely the reason that they've been given this power is because they are trusted to, but also because there are mechanisms in place that require them to follow the law, to use the coercive power that's been entrusted to them only within the limits of the law and to enforce the law. And as opposed to that, in a variety of ways, right? The President of the United States and his administration have made it absolutely clear that they want to use these power institutions to enforce what in political science these days we're calling um, autocratic legalism. Law not as, right, an impartial system of rules that constrains all of us, but the enforcement of law in order to intimidate the political opponents of the president or the party currently in power. And at that point, right, when on the one hand, the leadership of these organizations are directing the organizations to violate the law, to use the mechanisms of legal enforcement in ways that are not compatible with what the law allows. And on the other hand, you have, right, a recruitment of new people who are inspired precisely to do this, and a dismantling of the internal safeguards, some of them institutional, some of them to do with the norms, the culture, the understanding of the value of the institution on the part of the people who occupy positions of leadership within it. You, as I said to you, I believe last week, may still have a building that says Department of Justice on its uh, awning, but it is no longer the Department of Justice when it is targeting the enemies of the president, the perceived enemies of the president, the people the president doesn't like and wants retribution against. And similarly, ICE is no longer an immigration and customs enforcement agency. It is domestic shock troops. And so when we look at this, right, and we notice this is complex, multifaceted, and in many ways transforming American legal institutions, right? And then we notice, by the way, that the Trump team is going to put a partisan in charge of the Internal Revenue Services criminal unit, who is specifically directed to investigate Democrats and Democratic fundraising operations, right? When we see, right, the President of the United States and the Secretary of War addressing the brass of the military and telling them there's an enemy within and we want you deployed in American cities to fight with them, right, to repress them. When we have the vice president openly musing about whether or not the Insurrection Act can be invoked by the president. And please note, right, this is an act that gives tremendous latitude to the president to determine when it can be invoked and then allows him to deploy troops to the streets of the United States. It's a scary prospect. And then I just want to add, I've been looking at this article. Just Security, I think, is a very good website for tracking what's happening in the Supreme Court and its broader effects. And the idea, this is traced by these authors, Stephen Leppert and Eugene Fidel. One of them teaches military law at Yale. Another is a retired justice advocate general, JAG, in the US military. And they write about the Trump versus the United States decision from the Supreme Court, United States versus Trump decision from the Supreme Court in the summer 2024, which said, in short, that the President of the United States is exempt from criminal prosecution for violation of the law while in office, even after leaving office. And they point out how problematic this is from the perspective of military justice and the idea that the troops are told you have to follow the law and you are required by oath to not follow an order that violates the law. But the Supreme Court has now said that the President of the United States is not legally accountable for criminal action. The President of the United States is not only, right, the chief executive of the executive branch, he is also the commander-in-chief of the military. It sets up a real ambiguity about whether or not there are legal limits on what American troops can do in light of the fact that the President of the United States is their commander and that he is immune from criminal prosecution. Is the law now, in a sense, powerless to restrain the president, and by extension, what is called trickle-down immunity, the troops? And if the Insurrection Act is deployed, and if then troops are deployed to American streets, what will this mean for American democracy? I want to start with the undermining of American constitutional democracy. I want to be quick here, right? This is ongoing. George Santos, of course, was just released from jail where he was supposed to serve a 7-year sentence, right? This is one of many politically motivated commutations or pardons in the early months of Trump's second term, including everyone who was prosecuted and convicted for assaulting police and invading the Capitol on January 6th at Trump's behest, right? That we have more and more career prosecutors being fired by the Department of Justice because they're unwilling to charge people who they conclude there is no chance that they would actually be able to convict. And then we have Pam Bondi and the Assistant Director of the Department of Justice, along with Kash Patel, the Director of the FBI, in the White House, sitting quietly by while Donald Trump speaks from the presidential podium, telling him it's time to prosecute more of his enemies, naming people. Again, the idea that this is no longer the Department of Justice as we've known it for the last 70 years. This is a totally different institution that now does the president's dirty work, not because the law requires or permits it, but only because it's the president's whim or will that the people he doesn't like be harried by the law. And so, right, attacking the independent executive administrative agencies to establish unilateral control over all of the power in the federal government, pushing out anybody who would restrain him, and using then the machinery of the government of the United States to dispense favors on those Trump likes and punish those he doesn't like. This includes, I'll just add this very quickly, very large signing bonuses. I'm seeing $50,000 to $80,000. It boggles the mind for new ICE recruits. Weaponizing law enforcement, the rule of law, and power agencies to attack the opposition. That means both the organized infrastructure of the Democratic Party, for instance, its fundraising apparatus, and ordinary people out on the streets to protest it when the government attacks an apartment building in the middle of the night using helicopters and rappelling troops down and dragging children and parents out barely clothed into the streets, many of them in handcuffs or restraints in the middle of the night. And then people turn up to protest this, and more force and violence is directed against them, attacking the freedom of the press to stifle dissent, using immigration and customs enforcement to reassert racial despotism. Nearly 20% of the American population is Latino, and now it appears that many of them need to fear going out in public in many cities in the United States because the Supreme Court has said it's okay for them to be targeted on nothing but a racial profile, undermining the independence of key civil society actors, universities, the press, law firms, in order to prevent us from checking what the government is doing, and militarizing state police power and using it to target, quote, opposition cities, politicians for occupation and intimidation. And by the way, our safeguards are not working, right? I hope this is clear, but in ordinary circumstances, it would seem to me the regular course of action would be to go to the courts, to wait for the next election. But the courts are not working, Congress is not working, and there is, I think, serious risk that the next elections, although they will go off, will not be free and fair, and that the President of the United States and his administration will attempt to meddle with the registration, the counting of the vote. And so, right, Congress is not doing its job. The Roberts Court is using the emergency or shadow docket in unprecedented and frankly borderline lawless ways, not acting like a court, but acting like partisan cheerleaders for this administration, and in so doing, giving them the appearance of legal legitimacy because the Supreme Court said it's okay to do this. This is fracturing the court system and it's fracturing our society. It is corroding collective consciousness. And I'm going to spend a few minutes on this concept with you. It's something I'm thinking about right now because it's something I'm teaching at the college. This is a concept from the French sociologist, one of the founders of the field of sociology, Émile Durkheim. And in books like The Division of Labor in Society and Suicide, he talks about the necessity of a society in order to integrate its members into a shared imagined community. And here he's really thinking about complex, what he calls organic societies, in which, right, the kin structure is far too overwhelmed by the size and diversity of the population to be an institution of social integration. We are members of the same national community with hundreds of millions of people. How do we sustain that? Well, Durkheim suggests we need to have certain shared core beliefs, mores, and manners in common with each other. And that one of the ways in which we not only maintain those shared beliefs, which he refers to as our collective consciousness, but also continue to express their importance, right? This is not the same as routine stuff. We no longer live in a society in which it is an affront to jaywalk, right? And if you park your car past when the meter expires, okay, you have to pay a little fine if the traffic person catches you, but you're not doing something that says to your fellow citizens, I'm not one of us and I don't adhere to our shared norms. But when you violate the norms that everybody knows, that everybody shares, then you have to be punished in a different way, Durkheim suggests. You don't just pay a fine, you typically go to court or put on trial, and if it turns out you in fact did do the thing that everybody in our society agrees is wrong, then you have to maybe surrender your freedom for a while. go to jail. And the reason we do this is not just because you've done harm to someone by violating the law, but because you have harmed the collective consciousness of our society, our shared sense that certain things are allowed and other things are not allowed, that it is permissible to overstay your time at the meter and pay that fine, right? That's not going to cause our society to come apart. But on the other hand, if you attempt to use violence to overthrow the results of an election, if you attempt to use disinformation and fraud in order to secure a seat in Congress and thereby, right, undo the mechanisms via which we choose our representatives and determine that this is the kind of person that we want to give power to, well, yes, you have done something that up until quite recently, everyone agreed was impermissible and that the shared agreement held our society together. And what Donald Trump is doing by corrupting these institutions, by granting these pardons and commutations, is attacking the collective consciousness of the United States. Or to put it differently, he is constricting the community to whom it applies. If you are a Republican, it's okay. If you support me, it's okay to do things that up until quite recently were not permitted and everyone recognized was not permitted. On the other hand, if you're a Democrat and engaging in peaceful civil disobedience or demonstration, well, you can be subject to violence. This is, right, an especially dangerous form of what Durkheim called anomie, right? Lack of shared norms and values. And the president is using executive power and lawless state action, as well as powers that the Constitution gives him, but assumes, I think, that he will use in good faith, like the power to pardon and commute. He is using them to divide us, to suggest that there are true Americans and false Americans, that there is a battle between the true Americans and, quote, the enemy from within, and to mobilize then that internecine hatred and violence to prop up his rule, which is, let us remember, not especially popular right now. I'm distressed to say that these techniques are not further undermining his popularity. And I do think we have to take seriously the idea that maybe 40% of the population supports him either despite or because of the extremism of his policies. But that means that roughly 60% of the American population doesn't. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind. So let's talk a little bit more about what's happening with ICE, and then I want to get a little bit deeper into the analysis of what this is doing to our society. So I want to talk about the conversion of ICE into a lawless paramilitary organization operating at Trump's whim to create terror in areas he targets for repression. And as I've said to you in the past, part of the reason Donald Trump didn't try to do this directly with the FBI or alcohol, firearms, and tobacco, or even the National Guard, and especially with the military, is because each of those organizations has internal cultures that are strongly committed to impartiality, nonpartisanship, respect for the rule of law. They have been corrupted and they are going to continue to be corrupted as long as Donald Trump is in the Oval Office and unrestrained by his own administration, an administration that was directly, purposely, intentionally constituted in order not to constrain the lawlessness and the corruption. And as long as the Democrats are not in control of any branch of the federal government, this will continue, right? So dismantling the internal guardrails at ICE and Homeland Security by firing those in charge of internal monitoring, complaints, and civil rights. And so the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties within the Department of Homeland Security has been all but dismantled. Those who are left have been mainly appointed by Kristi Nomi in order to basically allow everything that is happening. It is almost impossible to file a civil rights complaint against Homeland Security's or ICE in 2025 because this office has been hollowed out from within. Encouraging or de facto requiring agents to wear masks. These are ICE agents, right? And you saw those images. I'll show you more images as we get further into this. But producing anonymity and thereby limiting legal accountability and encouraging producing a sense of impunity, right? If you know that no one can identify you, you don't have a name tag, you don't have a badge number, you don't have your face showing, and you then, right, do what the ICE agents did the other day. I think this is in Chicago. I might be confused. It might be in Portland, but just run into a group who is doing nothing so harmful as playing music and throw to the ground a woman who's playing the clarinet and handcuff her and throw her into a car and speed away and detain her, right? If you were, right, accountable, if people could see your face, see your badge number, and you thought there was an intact, right, civil rights division, you might think twice about taking that line of action, right? The US military, when the troops were in Afghanistan and Iraq, actually disciplined their soldiers for conduct like that. You could be court-martialed while you're part of an occupying force fighting hostile insurgents. But in Chicago, you have complete license to do this to American citizens in the heart of one of the largest American cities. Threatening groups and state governments that resisted the spread of violent apprehensions with punitive or violent measures, right? And so the idea that, right, the federal government is using the threat of bringing lawless violence into cities in order to try to coerce local officials or withholding promised aid, dismantling FEMA and not giving the aid required to cities or states that are perceived to be blue cities. Again, this is all part and parcel of this effort to give ICE complete license to be an instrument of paramilitary fear in American City. The volume and speed of arrests and activities overwhelms lawyers and courts' capacities to defend immigrants and the civil rights of citizens. And then you use social media and the mainstream media and its very partitioned, siloed nature, so that Fox News basically has become, for the most part, the propaganda wing, the state media outlet of the White House. So you do that to seed the narrative that these urban areas are lawless, that the resistance is not by ordinary citizens standing up for their neighbors, but by a, quote, Antifa terrorist organization, and to suggest, quote, from Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, it's almost too extreme to be believable, right? That the Democratic Party's main constituency is made up of Hamas terrorists, illegal aliens, and violent criminals, right? Again, not just an effort to polarize, an effort to partition Americans. Either you're with that party and then you support Hamas, terrorism, illegal aliens, violent criminals, drugs on the streets, lawless cities, or you're with us, in which case you have to fight the enemy within using these extreme measures because we're in an existential fight for the future of our country. I do want to say that this falls on somewhat sympathetic ears in too many places in the United States. That's in part because our media system is fractured. It's in part because we're so politically polarized, but it is also in part because so many Americans feel that this country has moved away from them, that the political elite has shown indifference to them, that their lives have become more dangerous and more precarious. And so, as we express our outrage and the need to actively resist through nonviolent protest politics what is coming out of the White House and the federal government right now, we also need to recognize that this does not succeed unless and until we are able to convince our fellow citizens that although we absolutely, unequivocally reject what's coming out of the Trump administration, that does not mean that we think we've done no wrong, or that they don't have complaints, or that we don't need to listen to them. To get past this impasse, we need to be able to convince our fellow citizens who are susceptible to being mobilized on the idea that there's an enemy within, that we are not your enemies, and that we do understand your suffering and your grievance, but we do not believe we know that it does not justify this course of action. And so, with all of that said, let me move just for a moment into Chicago and ICE. And right to note, right, that again, Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And this is allowing for a partitioning again. And that it is, again, part of, I think, the long term problem of the United States that is contributing to the short term crisis of the Trump administration. I just want to add additionally, right? You and I have this conversation every week, right? And we feel freedom to do so. We are not in an authoritarian society. We are not in a fascist society. We are actually in a society where many of the institutions of liberal democracy are still functioning for us. There's this line, right, that authoritarianism is here. It's just unevenly distributed. And that idea, I think, is one of the limits of ICE and the means of federal repression right now. There aren't enough troops for them to be everywhere all the time. There aren't enough people who support them for civil society to become an effective mechanism of repression across the board. And there's so many of us who resist this and who are accustomed to living in a free society with freedom of speech, that this is going to be very difficult to actually succeed in the effort to, right, use repression to sow the seeds of fear, to intimidate the opposition in order to dismantle democracy is going to be a huge uphill battle. But please do note, right, that ICE's funding, my diagram says it's been tripled, well, tripled from last year, but it's about 5 times as high as it was 10 years ago. And clearly, they are recruiting from people who want to be the shock troops of the government in the blue cities in the United States. Donald Trump, as I say, his popularity is largely unaffected. And this does reflect the fact that we are deeply polarized and that our media system is continuing to polarize us. If anything, his approval has improved ever so slightly. Not that it's high, but I would think that if we lived in a society with intact democratic values and our government was bringing repression down upon one of our cities, that this would be a situation in which the floor would fall out. That is not happening for the president's approval. So um, I'm just trying to think what else I should talk with you about today. I want to really focus for the remaining time, not only on the material we've talked about before. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat's How Democracies Die, right, which is a product really of the first Trump administration. But I think one of the indications of its lasting power is how prophetic this work is and how relevant it remains, right? So throw the referees out, right? Get rid of the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Monitoring Office within the Department of Homeland Security so that there's nobody there to complain to when ICE pulls you out of your bed in the middle of the night using shock troop tactics because they suspect there are drug dealers in your apartment. Deny the opponent's legitimacy, right? Call the right Democrats the enemy of the people, so people who are supporters of Hamas and terrorism and illegal aliens and gangs. Tolerate and encourage violence and change the rules of the game. And please note, at this point, the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, really only the Supreme Court, are actively engaged in doing this as well. So it does seem to me, right, that when Donald Trump says, I am your warrior, I am your justice, and those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution, this is, right, a full on assault, an attack on liberal institutions and elites that many Americans do feel are stacked against them, right? And that it is, right, the effort of Project 2025, of the Trump administration, to really use the power of the state to weaponize politics in the United States. Let me move to this, and this is where I'll conclude today. The idea that we've talked about together before, going back to Durkheim, that for many people, what is happening in the United States with the move into a post traditional culture, a culture where religion seems to have less of a hold for many of us, where the religion of the parent is not necessarily the religion of the child, where many people treat gender as elective as opposed to biological. Many people treat their gender identity as not relevant to their equal standing or their role in society. This combined with increased migration, racial diversification, and the sustained challenge on the part of racial minorities and white liberals to racial hierarchy has led many people to feel that the old moral order doesn't hold, right? That society is supposed to morally regulate and socially integrate us into stable roles and norms that make us intelligible and accountable to each other. And as opposed to that, we now have just too rapid change, too much tumult, too many people coming from too many different cultures and not willing to assimilate or integrate into a common culture. This is underlined by dislocating economic change, right? Many people who thought they were stably part of the middle class have tumbled out and become much more precarious. That gives rise independently to social anxiety, to evaluative threat. And the result is that many people are feeling increased normative threat, are feeling that we have fallen out of the healthy realm of social integration and moral regulation and into something closer to enemy and egoism. And that Trump's use of pardons, and in particular, pardons to express, right, implicit um, endorsement of political violence or political fraud, or that the people who engage in political violence and fraud because they support Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again movement and are trying to forcefully reassert these norms, that what they're doing is okay. Whereas the people engaged in protest against this, what they're doing makes them an enemy, makes them terrorists, makes them therefore liable to state sanctioned civil violence. This means that we are coming apart, that we are bifurcated or partitioned as a society, and that the President of the United States, rather than unifying us, is precisely trying to get us to accept the idea that we are fractured and that there is a party of repression and a party of resistance. And I'm afraid this may, in fact, be objectively true right now. I won't go into these details. Maybe we can do more of this next week. But the idea that when we engage in protest politics, as many of us did yesterday, and we don't have a count yet, but we do know that the previous No King's Day protests were perhaps the largest, or certainly among the largest protests in the United States. And when protests work, here I'm looking at John Rawls' analysis of the conditions for the success of civil disobedience, that it is because there is a shared understanding of justice, and that what your willingness to go into the streets expresses to fellow citizens is that the shared sense of justice is not being respected, upheld, it's being violated, and that the institutions through which we would normally express our protest against that are no longer working. And so we need to take extraordinary, extrajudicial, take the politics into the street, make some bad trouble in order to say to our fellow citizens, this is intolerable, and to the extent that you agree that you belong in community with us and that we have shared norms which include a shared understanding of justice, then you need to recognize that what you're doing right now is intolerable. I think that is the motive behind the protests yesterday and earlier, and hopefully forthcoming in the future. I will also say one of the lessons from the history of the rise of 21st century autocracy is that very often the party of liberal democracy, the party of resistance, doesn't recognize quickly enough that the rules of the game have been thrown out by the other party, and that they really are no longer in community with them. And this then presents the alternative way of diagramming this and thinking about this. If we no longer have a shared sense of justice with at least some of our fellow Americans, we can no longer expect protest on its own to reach them. And at this point, we have to recognize the danger and also the strategic necessity of pivoting to means of resistance that don't rely on our fellow citizens coming to their senses, recognizing what they're doing wrong, or alternatively that suggest the state has been too corrupted and the instruments of power are now being used to choke off the avenues of normal expression of political resistance and then correction of course. And in those conditions, we need to be much better organized, because what we have is an existential battle for the future of constitutional democracy about to play out in our society. Let me stop there. I feel like each time the alarm gets louder, but I do think it is time to be alarmed. Anne, I can see you've got your hand up already. Please go ahead.
You keep using if we have gotten to this place, if there's the one side is not saying the, I don't think it's if anymore.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm speaking in that way. I guess still reluctant to accept that this is where we are, but I agree with you. This is where we are. And I think there are things that we need to be cautious and conditional about. How many of our fellow citizens actually like what ICE is doing in Chicago? I don't know. And I'm not sure polling data is going to adequately capture this. But having said that, what is happening in Chicago is happening in Chicago. There's no and, if, or but about it. And this is state repression of fellow citizens for nothing worse than expressing their dissent, their views, right? And not just state repression. This is the kind of brutality that would have in earlier moments in our history led to these agents losing their jobs and ending up in court for abuse of power, maybe losing their freedom. And as opposed to that, they are being egged on, encouraged, licensed to act with impunity by our government. No doubt that that is happening. The thing that I think we have to be a little bit more um, nuanced about is how many of our fellow citizens see this and say, about time, and how many of them say, you know, oh my God, and how many of them are frankly ignorant and maybe even indifferent to it, right? An awful lot depends on what that ratio is, what it looks like. But Anne, thank you for the corrective. It is happening, and that's the. I don't know if you saw the title, right? It is happening here. Yeah. Thank you, Anne. Did you want to
Okay.
follow up or not?
Well, I just feel that I'm concerned that we, those on this side of the
Yeah.
fence, um, are we going to wait too long and keep saying, well, maybe they'll come around. Maybe we can just get away with, this. And I don't know what the next step would be, but I'm concerned that we may not be taking it as seriously as it needs to be.
Yeah, excellent, Anna. And I'll just say this very briefly. This is part of the problem with concluding that the normal mechanisms of checks and balances, the normal avenues of expressing dissent via elections are not working, right? We are now in the much more difficult to predict terrain of repression versus resistance, right? And please note that Chicago makes it clear that Donald Trump intends to use the power of the federal government to occupy and repress cities in the United States in order to try to bring them to heel, to intimidate them. And it also appears he's considering bringing the American military into this. And he is laying the groundwork for getting the federal government directly involved in tabulating the results of the 2026 election, which again could totally upend our capacity to use normal electoral mechanisms to say, no way, that's not us, you got to stop, right? So that throws us into the realm of politics in the street. And that's a realm where it's much more difficult to know when to act, how to act, what to do. And please note, right, that in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, we had the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the anti war movement, the farmers' rights and immigrants' rights movements. We were well schooled in the tools and forms of politics of civil disobedience and organizing. We knew how to do this. And I think part of what has happened in the intervening 50 years is we've become much more dependent upon just using occasional elections and not regular, organized political protest to accomplish what we hope to accomplish. We're much less effective in doing it, but we also now have to very quickly relearn some of what we've forgotten or train new generations in the politics of effective organizing, which involves much more than going to a protest on a Saturday every few months. That's the tip of the iceberg, the starting point, but it can't be the end point. Thank
Hmm.
you, Anne. It says Dorothy, but I don't think that's Dorothy. Go ahead.
I am Dorothy.
You are Dorothy. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not seeing you clearly. Go ahead, Dorothy.
Seem a bit sanguine about the possibility of participation by the military. And I think, given the response of the upper echelons, that seems okay. But if you watch the response of West Pointers, for example, to Trump's speech there, or to speeches to the troops by both Vance and Hegseth, they seem quite enthusiastic. So I'm just wondering if we really can't worry about that as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's going to put the military in a terrible position if the president invokes the Insurrection Act and attempts to deploy them into the cities. I imagine the scenario in which large swaths of the military leadership resigns, but is promptly replaced by Hegseth and Trump with people who are much more compliant, right? This is the MO of this administration. Get those who believe in the rule of law or the customary norms that are associated with the good that the institution in question is supposed to serve out of the way so that you can replace them with political hacks and lackeys who will just do whatever the president tells them to do. Now, having said that, I I want to be careful here again, and this is similar to what I said to Anne. I think there might be a significant portion of the American military who have a great deal of sympathy, and here we're talking about the troops, the rank and file, right? Um, the ordinary enlisted soldiers who have a great deal of sympathy for Trump and his brand of politics. But I also think there are probably a lot of enlisted people who have no sympathy for it whatsoever, right? And one of the things that I'm seeing with the National Guard, it reminds me of what happened in China with Tiananmen Square, when they wanted to use their military to repress peaceful pro-democracy protesters in Beijing. They brought in troops from thousands of miles away who had no ethnic identification. They actually spoke a different language from the people of Beijing, and they were also drawn from a different class background, right? And so if you can um, find people who don't identify with the domestic, right, co-countrymen they're being asked to repress, then you have a much better likelihood of the troops actually carrying out the internal repression. That's what ICE is, right? ICE is clearly recruited to do this. The US military is not. It's much more internally diverse. And I can imagine a lot of soldiers who would not pick up a gun and shoot at a fellow citizen, even if
Hi.
there are some that would. And at the same time, I will just say very quickly, right? This is part of the reason I think that Donald Trump wants to use the National Guard from Texas in Oregon and Illinois, and not necessarily the internal, right, National Guard, because he thinks that the National Guard from Texas is much more likely to not identify with and be willing to repress the people of another state. I think the right main branches of the armed forces a little bit too diverse to reliably repress fellow citizens. Though if you give them direct orders to do it, boy, it's going to be a difficult situation for everybody involved. Thank you. Great comment, Dorothy. Sorry I didn't recognize you at first. Yes, Ruth, go ahead.
John and I went through the online of the New York Times and didn't see anything about the protests yesterday. What's going on with that? Why wouldn't they
There,
mention protests?
there's an article on the front page, Ruth.
There is.
Yeah, and there's an article.
Not your front page, you mean the New York front page, not our front page.
Well, so I get the paper copy, but
Uh-huh.
if you're looking at it online, one of the things to remember is that it is probably configured by an algorithm. So your front page may be different from my front page, right? But on my front page, on my electronic version, I'm trying to get to it. I'll stop. But there were several stories. And so one was
Really?
the protests themselves. One was about the way in which the New York Times covers the protests and the fact that they
Uh-huh.
don't look at crowd size at first. They look more at content. So yes, there was some coverage.
That's
And
great. I don't know why it's not on mine, but thanks.
yeah, you bet. Anybody else? Well, I'm glad we got to do this at a time that worked for more of you. And boy, I am not happy to be conveying this news to you. But on the other hand, boy, we had better be eyes wide open about this, prepared, vigilant, because yes, I do think we're at that moment in our politics. And I think it's been quite a while. Maybe there were moments in the 1960s that felt like this as well, or under Nixon, but where it is a struggle between repression and resistance, where the idea that we are part of a national community, where we have certain levels of respect for each other, I think this is really becoming unglued in the United States in the 21st century under Donald Trump. Be well, take care, keep making good trouble. I will see everyone next week, I think, at our regular time for another meeting. Bye, everybody. Good being with you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you, guys. Bye bye.